This is chapter 2 of Jane Eyre. In chapter 1, Jane gets in trouble and is sent to the Red Room, basically for standing up to her horrible cousin John. Chapter 2. I resisted all the way, a new thing for me, and a circumstance which greatly strengthened the bad opinion Bessie and Miss Abbott were disposed to entertain of me. The fact is, I was a trifle beside myself, or rather out of myself, as the French would say. I was conscious that a moment's mutiny had already rendered me liable to strange penalties, and, like any other rebel slave, I felt resolved, in my desperation, to go all lengths. "Hold her arms, Miss Abbott, she's like a mad cat." For shame, cried the lady's maid. "What shocking conduct, Miss Eyre, to strike a young gentleman, your benefactress's son, your young master." "Master? How is he my master? Am I a servant?" "No, you are less than a servant, for you do nothing for your keep. There, sit down, and think over your wickedness." They had got me by this time into the apartment indicated by Mrs. Reed, and had thrust me upon a stool. My impulse was to rise from it like a spring. Their 2 pairs of hands arrested me instantly. "If you don't sit still, you must be tied down," said Bessie. "Miss Abbott, lend me your garters. She would break mine directly." Miss Abbott turned to divest a stout leg of the necessary ligature. This preparation for bonds, and the additional ignominy inferred, took a little of the excitement out of me. My students, you should know what ignominy means. Nathaniel Hawthorne uses it all the time in the Scarlet Letter. In this case, it means public shame and disgrace. So not only is Jane being punished unjustly, but now she's also feeling embarrassed and humiliated by that punishment. "Do take them off," I cried. "I will not stir." In guarantee whereof, I attached myself to my seat by my hands. "Mind you don't," said Bessie, and when she had ascertained that I was really subsiding, she loosened her hold of me. Then she and Miss Abbott stood with folded arms, looking darkly and doubtfully on my face, as incredulous of my sanity. "She never did so before," at last said Bessie, turning to the Abigail. "But it was always in her," was the reply. "I've told Mrs. often my opinion about the child, and Mrs. agreed with me. She's an underhand little thing. I never saw a girl of her age with so much cover." Bessie answered not, but ere long, addressing me, she said, "You ought to be aware, miss, that you are under obligations to Mrs. Reed. She keeps you. If she were to turn you off, you would have to go to the poorhouse." I had nothing to say to these words. They were not new to me. My very first recollections of existence included hints of the same kind. This reproach of my dependence had become a vague sing-song in my ear, very painful and crushing, but only half intelligible. Miss Abbott joined in. "And you ought not to think yourself on an equality with the Mrs. Reed and Master Reed, because Mrs. kindly allows you to be brought up with them. They will have a great deal of money, and you will have none. It is your place to be humble, and to try to make yourself agreeable to them." "What we tell you is for your good," added Bessie, in her harsh voice. "You should try to be useful and pleasant, then, perhaps, you would have a home here. But if you become passionate and rude, Mrs. will send you away, I am sure. Besides," said Miss Abbott, "God will punish her. He might strike her dead in the midst of her tantrums, and then where would she go? Come, Bessie, we will leave her. I wouldn't have her heart for anything. Say your prayers, Miss Eyre, when you are by yourself, for if you don't repent, something bad might be permitted to come down the chimney and fetch you away." Just notice here that there is a difference between Abbott, who is Mrs. Reed's maid, kind of like a lady's maid, and Bessie, who spends more time with the children, is most likely in the nursery, and probably a nanny figure. Abbott is very, very harsh. They're both harsh in locking her in the Red Room, but Abbott says things like, "Oh, if we leave you alone in here, you'd better repent, or where would you go?" kind of implying that Jane would go to hell. She also mentioned something had snatched you out of the chimney, makes the same sort of class distinction that John Reed makes in the first chapter, says you're not going to have anything, you're a dependent here. The Reeds are taking you in, they're of a higher social station, and Bessie's a little bit more moderate. She's kind of saying, we're telling you these things for your own good, make sure you know that you're under Mrs. Reed's supervision. If you get turned out of here, you don't have anywhere to go but to the poorhouse. So there's a subtle distinction between the two of them, but it is there. They went, shutting the door and locking it behind them. The Red Room was a square chamber, very seldom slept in, I might say never, indeed, unless when a chance influx of visitors at Gateshead Hall rendered it necessary to turn to account all the accommodation it contained. Yet it was one of the largest and stateliest chambers in the mansion. A bed supported on massive pillars of mahogany hung with curtains of deep red damask stood out like a tabernacle in the center. The two large windows, with their blinds always drawn down, were half shrouded in festoons and falls of similar drapery. The carpet was red, the table at the foot of the bed was covered with a crimson cloth. The walls were a soft fawn color with a blush of pink in it. The wardrobe, the toilet table, the chairs were of darkly polished old mahogany. Just a side note, the toilet table is not actually like by a toilet bowl. Toilet was just a word used to mean your getting ready process and stages. So it'd be something like a vanity, a toilet table. It'd have your makeup on it, hairbrush, mirror, that sort of thing. So no actual toilets. Out of these deep surrounding shades rose high and glared white the piled-up mattresses and pillows of the bed, spread with a snowy Marseille counterpane. Scarcely less prominent was an ample cushioned easy-chair near the head of the bed, also white, with a footstool before it, and looking, as I thought, like a pale throne. This room was chill because it seldom had a fire. It was silent because remote from the nursery and kitchen, solemn because it was known to be so seldom entered. The housemaid alone came here on Saturdays, to wipe from the mirrors and the furniture a week's quiet dust, and Mrs. Reed herself, at far intervals, visited to review the contents of a certain secret drawer in the wardrobe, where were stored divers parchments, her jewel casket, and a miniature of her deceased husband. And in those last words lies the secret of the Red Room, the spell which kept it so lonely in spite of its grandeur. Mr. Reed had been dead 9 years. It was in this chamber he breathed his last, here he lay in state, hence his coffin was borne by the undertaker's men. And since that day a sense of dreary consecration had guarded it from frequent intrusion. So now we find out what's going on with this Red Room, why it's so particularly ominous to Jane. This is where Mr. Reed, who is Jane's uncle, as we find out in a page or two, this is where Mr. Reed died, where his body was laid out, and then eventually where he was taken to the undertaker. So it has this very sort of negative connotation, and it also has kind of a creepy atmosphere to it. Everything's either really bright dark red or a stark white contrast. It's very somber and oppressive. My seat, to which Bessie and the bitter Miss Abbott had left me riveted, was a low ottoman near the marble chimney-piece. The bed rose before me. To my right hand there was the high dark wardrobe with subdued broken reflections varying the gloss of its panels. To my left were the muffled windows, a great-looking glass between them repeated the vacant majesty of the bed and room. I was not quite sure whether they had locked the door, and when I dared move, I got up and went to see. Alas, yes, no jail was ever more secure. Returning, I had to cross before the looking-glass. My fascinated glance involuntarily explored the depth it revealed. All looked colder and darker in that visionary hollow than in reality, and the strange little figure there gazing at me, with a white face and arms specking the gloom, and glittering eyes of fear moving where all else was still, had the effect of a real spirit. I thought it like one of the tiny phantoms, half fairy, half imp, Bessie's evening stories represented as coming out of lone, ferny dells and moors, and appearing before the eyes of belated travelers. I returned to my stool. So Jane passes the mirror. She goes to check if the door is really locked. It is, and as she's passing the mirror on her way back, she sees her own reflection, and she looks sort of ghostly and alien to herself. Superstition was with me at that moment, but it was not yet her hour for complete victory. My blood was still warm. The mood of the revolted slave was still bracing me with its bitter vigor. I had to stem a rapid rush of retrospective thought before I quailed the dismal present. All John Reed's violent tyrannies, all his sister's proud indifference, all his mother's aversion, all the servants' partiality, turned up in my disturbed mind like a dark deposit in a turbid well. Why was I always suffering, always browbeaten, always accused, forever condemned? Why could I never please? Why was it useless to try to win anyone's favor? Eliza, who was headstrong and selfish, was respected. Georgiana, who had a spoiled temper, a very acrid spite, a capricious and insolent carriage, was universally indulged. Her beauty, her pink cheeks and golden curls, seemed to give delight to all who looked at her, and to purchase indemnity for every fault. John no one thwarted, much less punished, though he twisted the necks of the pigeons, killed the little pea-chicks, set the dogs at the sheep, striped the hothouse vines of their fruit, and broke the buds off the choicest plants in the conservatory. He called his mother old girl, too, sometimes reviled her for her dark skin, similar to his own, bluntly disregarded her wishes, not unfrequently tore and spoiled her silk attire. He was still her own darling. I dared commit no fault. I strove to fulfill every duty, and I was termed naughty and tiresome, sullen and sneaking, from morning to noon and from noon to night. So Jane's reflecting on the difference between her and her cousins, and she knows that they're not very kind children. So Eliza's very headstrong, so determined, but in a negative way, and selfish. She's liked. Georgiana is spoiled, has a really mean, nasty, like spiteful streak to her. She gets indulged. John, we find out some really disturbing information, as if throwing a book at his 10-year-old cousin when he's 14 wasn't bad enough. We find out that he twists the necks of pigeons, so he's just killing pigeons for fun. Killed the little pea chicks, so he's killing little chicken babies. Set the dogs at the sheep, so he's making the dogs attack the sheep. Stripped the hothouse vines of their fruit, so he's just pulling off fruit for no reason. He's kind of a little monster, this kid. And then Jane tries her best to not get in trouble and is just not considered part of his family. My head still ached and bled with the blow and fall I had received. No one had reproved John for wantonly striking me, and because I had turned against him to avert farther irrational violence, I was loaded with general opprobrium. Unjust, said my reason, forced by the agonizing stimulus into precocious, though transitory, power. And resolve, equally wrought up, instigated some strange expedient to achieve escape from insupportable oppression, as running away, or, if that could not be effected, never eating or drinking more, and letting myself die. So Jane knows that she's treated unfairly, but doesn't really know what to do about it. If you're looking at the text of this, resolve is capitalized, so Charlotte Brontë is personifying it, saying that she's determined and she's resolved to do something, but she doesn't really have any sort of recourse. She doesn't have anything to turn to. So she thinks about running away, and then she thinks, if that's not going to work, maybe I'll just starve myself so I can die. That's a pretty dark thing for a 10-year-old child to be thinking. What a consternation of soul was mine that dreary afternoon. How all my brain was in tumult, and all my heart in insurrection. Yet in what darkness, what dense ignorance, was the mental battle fought. I could not answer the ceaseless inward question, why I thus suffered. Now, at the distance of, I will not say how many years, I see it clearly. So keep in mind that the adult Jane is narrating this story. So she's 10 years old when this chapter takes place, but she's looking back at this now from the perspective of an adult, someone who's grown up. We don't know by how many years, but someone who's grown up and can look back at this a little differently. So the paragraph that follows is not the thought of a 10-year-old child. This is grown-up Jane thinking this. I was a discord in Gateshead Hall. I was like nobody there. I had nothing in harmony with Mrs. Reed or her children, or her chosen vassalage. If they did not love me, in fact, as little did I love them. They were not bound to regard with affection a thing that could not sympathize with one amongst them, a heterogeneous thing, opposed to them in temperament, in capacity, and propensities, a useless thing, incapable of serving their interest or adding to their pleasure, a noxious thing, cherishing the germs of indignation at their treatment, of contempt at their judgment. I know that had I been a sanguine, brilliant, careless, exacting, handsome, romping child, though equally dependent and friendless, Mrs. Reed would have endured my presence more complacently. Her children would have entertained for me more of the cordiality of fellow feeling. The servants would have been less prone to make me the scapegoat of the nursery. So Jane knows that she's not like anyone else in Gateshead, and that's why she is so victimized. Again, that's adult Jane that knows that, not 10-year-old Jane. And she feels that if she had been a little bit more like Eliza and Georgiana and John Reed, just kind of, very determined to get her own way, and if she had been prettier, and if she had been more less worried and less concerned and more just kind of like bouncing around and energetic, not necessarily joyful, just more energetic, that she may not have been so excluded. Daylight began to forsake the Red Room. It was past 4 o'clock, and the beclouded afternoon was tending to drear twilight. I heard the rain still beating continuously on the staircase window, and the wind howling in the grove behind the hall. I grew by degrees cold as a stone, and then my courage sank. My habitual mood of humiliation, self-doubt, forlorn depression fell damp on the embers of my decaying ire. All said I was wicked, and perhaps I might be so. What thought had I been just conceiving of starving myself to death? That was certainly a crime, and was I fit to die? Or was a vault under the chancel of Gateshead Church an inviting bourne? In such vault had I been told did Mr. Reed lie buried, and led by this thought to recall his idea, I dwelt on it with gathering dread. I could not remember him, but I knew that he was my own uncle, my mother's brother, that he had taken me when a parentless infant to his house, and that in his last moments he had required a promise of Mrs. Reed that she would rear and maintain me as one of her own children. Mrs. Reed probably considered she had kept this promise, and so she had, I dare say, as well as her nature would permit her. But how could she really like an interloper not of her race, and unconnected with her, after her husband's death, by any tie? It must have been most irksome to find herself bound by a hard-wrung pledge to stand in the stead of a parent to a strange child she could not love, and to see an uncongenial alien permanently intruded on her own family group. So now we found out exactly how Jane is related to these other characters. So Mr. Reed, the man who died in the Red Room, was married to Mrs. Reed. Mr. Reed passed away, and before he passed away, he made Mrs. Reed promise that she would take care of Jane and watch over her and raise her like their own child. So Jane is Mr. Reed's niece and Mrs. Reed's niece. Mr. Reed had a sister by blood, so that blood sister is Jane's mother. So Mr. Reed is the blood relative, and Mrs. Reed is her aunt by marriage. Normally, especially nowadays, this isn't such a big distinction, but apparently it matters a great deal to Mrs. Reed. She thinks of Jane as someone not of her own race because she's not related by blood to Jane. It's a sort of justification for Mrs. Reed's treatment of her, but it doesn't really hold up at all. A singular notion dawned on me. I doubted not, never doubted, that if Mr. Reed had been alive, he would have treated me kindly. And now, as I sat looking at the white bed and overshadowed walls, occasionally also turning a fascinated eye towards the dimly gleaming mirror, I began to recall what I had heard of dead men, troubled in their graves by the violation of their last wishes, revisiting the earth to punish the perjured and avenge the oppressed. And I thought Mr. Reed's spirit, harassed by the wrongs of his sister's child, might quit its abode, whether in the church vault or in the unknown world of the departed, and rise before me in this chamber. I wiped my tears and hushed my sobs, fearful lest any sign of violent grief might waken a preternatural voice to comfort me, or elicit from the gloom some hallowed face, bending over me with strange pity. This idea, consolatory in theory, I felt would be terrible if realized. With all my might, I endeavored to stifle it. I endeavored to be firm. Shaking my hair from my eyes, I lifted my head and tried to look boldly round the dark room. At this moment, a light gleamed on the wall. Was it, I asked myself, a ray from the moon penetrating some aperture in the blind? No, moonlight was still, and this stirred. While I gazed, it glided up to the ceiling and quivered over my head. I can now conjecture readily that this streak of light was, in all likelihood, a gleam from a lantern carried by someone across the lawn. But then, prepared as my mind was for horror, shaken as my nerves were by agitation, I thought the swift darting beam was a herald of some coming vision from another world. My heart beat thick, my head grew hot, a sound filled my ears which I deemed the rushing of wings. Something seemed near me. I was oppressed, suffocated. Endurance broke down. I rushed to the door and shook the lock in desperate effort. Steps came running along the outer passage. The key turned. Bessie and Abbott entered. "Miss Eyre, are you ill?" said Bessie. "What a dreadful noise! It went quite through me," exclaimed Abbott. "Take me out. Let me go into the nursery," was my cry. "What for? Are you hurt? Have you seen something?" again demanded Bessie. "Oh, I saw a light, and I thought a ghost would come." I had now got hold of Bessie's hand, and she did not snatch it from me. "She screamed out on purpose," declared Abbott in some disgust. "And what a scream! If she had been in great pain, one would have excused it, but she only wanted to bring us all here. I know her naughty tricks." "What is all this?" demanded another voice peremptorily. Mrs. Reed came along the corridor, her cap flying wide, her gown rustling stormily. "Abbott and Bessie, I believe I gave orders that Jane Eyre should be left in the Red Room till I came to her myself." "Miss Jane screamed so loud, ma'am," pleaded Bessie. Let her go, was the only answer. Loose Bessie's hand, child. You cannot succeed in getting out by these means, be assured. I abhor artifice, particularly in children. It is my duty to show you that tricks will not answer. You will now stay here an hour longer, and it is only on condition of perfect submission and stillness that I shall liberate you then. Oh, Anne, have pity. Forgive me. I cannot endure it. Let me be punished some other way. I shall be killed if— Silence. This violence is almost repulsive, and so no doubt she felt it. I was a precocious actress in her eyes. She sincerely looked on me as a compound of virulent passions, mean spirit, and dangerous duplicity. Bessie and Abbott having retreated, Mrs. Reed, impatient of my now frantic anguish and wild sobs, abruptly thrust me back and locked me in, without further parley. I heard her sweeping away, and soon after she was gone, I suppose I had a species of fit. Unconsciousness closed the scene. Oh, so she's stuck in the Red Room. She starts to think about how if Mr. Reed, her uncle, were alive, he would never let her be treated this way. And at first this is a sort of consoling thought that he would protect her and guide her and not let Mrs. Reed be so horrible and negligent towards her. And then she starts to think about it more, and then she imagines sort of his ghost coming back to defend her, and then instead of being comfortable that his ghost would protect her, she gets really freaked out because, oh my god, then that would be a ghost. She sees this light. Adult Jane kind of jumps in and says it was probably just someone carrying a lantern across the lawn and a light shadow hit on the wall. But 10-year-old Jane is not thinking that. 10-year-old Jane is thinking, oh my god, it's my uncle's ghost come back from the dead to avenge the wrongs. Begs to be let out of the room. You again kind of see that difference between Bessie and Abbott, where Bessie is willing to listen to what Jane has to say. She can tell that Jane's clearly frightened. Abbott doesn't care. She thinks that Jane is trying to scheme her way out of the room. Mrs. Reed thinks the same thing, locks her in there, and then Jane has some sort of species of fit by which we can assume that she faints. And that is the Red Room. Pretty gothic stuff.